From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
A land war in Europe, the worst inflation in 40 years, a stock market plunge and a wipeout in cryptocurrency, an historic year for the Supreme Court, and a change in political control narrowly in the House of Representatives, but not in the United States Senate. Those are some of the major stories this year as 2022 comes to a close and we look ahead to 2023. I'm Paul Gigot, editor of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages, and I'm here with my colleagues, Kim Strassel and Kate Batchelder Odell. And today we're going to look back at some of the major stories of the past year and tease out some of their implications for the future. And I think we have to start with the Ukraine war, Russia's invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, continuing now as we almost approach the first-year anniversary, changed the international landscape enormously. First real land war in Europe since World War II. And Kate, as you look at the implications of what this means, how has that war changed the world in the last year?
Well, Paul, I know counterfactuals are only so useful, but I do think you have to think about what would have happened if Russia had rolled right into Ukraine with success. And you have to look at Zelensky's decision not to flee the country and stay and fight as a pretty consequential one for the Ukrainian efforts that have followed and the impressive ability of beating back Russian troops. I think that's going to turn out to have been a pretty important decision, his decision to stay and fight. I think one thing that really comes out of this shift in the world order is that Americans have been making unrealistic assumptions about what would be required to defend the country and its interests abroad. So by that, I mean, we've used up, I believe now, 13 years worth of Stinger anti-aircraft weapon production in Ukraine from donating to Ukraine. I think there were a lot of defense planning assumptions that we would never see another artillery war in Europe and that we didn't need to be prepared for one. So I think one of the most important stories going into 2023 is a belated wake up to a new world that may require a more robust national defense, more spending on defense, and more domestic production of some of our best weapons. I think that has turned out to be one of the more consequential stories of the year from the war in Ukraine.
I would add that there was an awakening in Western Europe as well, that it turns out history has not ended, and Russian designs on a greater Russia has not ended. And the consequences are Finland and Sweden joining NATO on the path to doing so. The Germans, of all people, waking up and promising to spend more on defense and doing much more to make themselves less dependent on Russia for their energy supplies. The repudiation, not overtly but implicitly, of former Chancellor Angela Merkel's policy of engagement with Russia via trade, thinking that that could temper the ambitions, the imperial ambitions of Vladimir Putin, blown up in the war effort. And then Joe Biden's decision to support Ukraine with American arms and rallying the West to do so as well. Very significant. I give him high marks for that. But take a deduction for the fact that those weapons were provided at a very slow pace. They had to be, at every stage, had to be persuaded to give more. First, it was the Switchblade drones we slow rolled. Then later it was HIMAR artillery, then the weapons, longer range munitions. And now recently they're going to provide a Patriot battery for missile defense, but all of those could have been provided much earlier.
Yeah, and I agree with you. He gets high marks overall. But I would also point out that in addition to dragging his feet with Ukrainian aid, he even did so with some of our allies. You know, it took a while, for instance, to agree to some of the Eastern European countries' demands for backfilled weapons or a Patriot array in Poland, for instance. And all of this because Joe Biden, first mistake was seeming to think, along with everybody else, that this would be a very quick affair, that Russia would roll in, that Ukraine would roll over. And I think that accounted in the beginning for some of the slowness, simply the administration being surprised that the Ukrainians showed the fighting spirit that they did. The other excuse that has been far less persuasive, but has become the main rationale as we go ahead and exists even now for this delay and the slow rolling, is this supposed fear of provoking Vladimir Putin and worries that he will respond by doing something drastic. Now, there's still a possibility he could do that, but it's become more and more clear that there may be some limits to that, and that as a result, all of this wasted time has potentially harmed the Ukrainian ability to have gotten this war over with maybe even faster or get them closer to an endpoint. And again, I agree with Kate, counterfactuals aren't always helpful, but you have to wonder what this would look like if we had got that equipment to the Ukrainians right at the start.
The decision to arm Ukraine, in my view, is probably Joe Biden's best decision of the year, Kate. And I would say that if I had second best, it would be the export controls on AI-related technology and certain computer chips and the equipment to make those chips to China, which has, I think, been undercovered as a maybe by us as a major story this year. And certainly it's gotten the attention of the Chinese. I'm told that it was a big chunk of what President Xi Jinping spent his time when that head-to-head meeting in Bali with Joe Biden. That and Taiwan were the two big things on Xi's agenda.
That certainly seems to have captured China's attention. And I know one case for the export controls has been to slow their progress in this department as we try to weather what I think is wisely called a dangerous decade, where our traditional conventional defenses need to be revamped, basically using Cold War equipment. And so we have this dip in the 2020s before some of our new equipment comes online in the 2030s. And so the export controls are perhaps one way to buy us more time to weather that window. But they do seem to have gotten Beijing's attention and have very quickly attracted a response. And hopefully that will lead to some progress in our talks with them on some of these priorities like Taiwan.
The worst decision by Joe Biden, there's a lot of competition for that. I would say probably, in my view, begging foreign dictators to pump more oil while doing his best to make sure that the U.S. doesn't produce more, Kim. It's a matter of putting climate ideology against the very practical problems of a global energy crisis. What's your candidate?
Yeah, by the way, that is a pretty big one, and not just getting in the way of pumping more, but actually making it more difficult to continue doing what we're already doing from an energy front. Boy, it is a tough call. There are so many contenders, Paul, but I would have to maybe say his decision to cancel student loans unilaterally, a power that very clearly does not have. It was an enormous decision. It's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars. That case has now ended up at the Supreme Court. We will get a hearing on it. It seems very difficult to believe that they would allow this to proceed, given the extent to which the administration had to dig into old statutes to come up with a permission to do this in their minds. But a couple other I'd throw out there: Joe Biden's Jim Crow 2.0 rhetoric of this year and the false suggestion that some of these voting reforms in Republican states were actually about suppressing votes. That was shown to be untrue in the recent midterms, especially in a place like Georgia, where we had great midterm turnout. And then, of course, all the terrible legislation that Congress passed.
Well, we will get to some of that, but let's turn first to the biggest economic story of the year, which is the return with a vengeance of inflation. The largest inflation in 40 years, reaching a high of the Consumer Price Index a couple of months back of 9%, which has eroded real incomes for Americans, has led to sticker shock at the grocery store, gas pump, what have you. And the decision by our elites in Washington, the administration and the Treasury Department for a while, and of course the Federal Reserve, to say that this was all just transitory, it was going to go away. But the realization set in during the year that that wasn't going to happen. And Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Fed itself, turning its policy around, raising interest rates at a very rapid rate, 4 times, 75 basis points across the year. And the question is, are they going to stick with it as we go into 2023? So far, the signs are that the Fed will. Of course, the acid test of that will be what happens if there's a recession. So far, the Fed's decision, Kate, has had real consequences for stocks and bond prices. Recession in both of those, for sure, bear markets. But no larger financial contagion outside of cryptocurrencies, which I'm happy to say I haven't played in. I don't know about you, but Sam Bankman-Fried didn't look like the man to bank your money on.
Well, Paul, I think you're right that the risk now is pulling off on inflation too soon rather than too late. And I think Powell has been saying that he's more concerned about not doing enough than doing too much. And You have to keep in mind, we wrote earlier this month, the core CPI is still at a high annual rate of 6%. So this problem is hardly solved. On the plus side, I think we're really searching for silver linings here. If we say the crypto meltdown is in the good news category, that it hasn't caused a broader contagion, I think one fascinating point that we've been discussing in our pages is that perhaps the unregulated status of the crypto markets led investors to be more cautious than they otherwise would have been about putting assets into that field. And so I think that's one reason why we haven't seen that broader contagion. And it's an important point because Congress now is so interested in getting a crypto bill through that may be counterproductive and may actually be more likely to cause a broader meltdown than leaving it how it currently is.
Kim, you have any words on that front or looking ahead? I mean, where do you see potential risks in the financial markets?
Well, I think the biggest risk is that Powell does blink. And because let's be clear, we're already beginning to see it. The pressure on him from the political class and from the financial markets to turn to stop with the rate hikes. In their world, they'd actually like to see him cut again. That pressure is going to continue to rise, especially as you note, as we begin to potentially see more layoffs. We've already had some, but as the country potentially turns into a recession. So I think that that's one of the biggest risks. And then the other risks that I worry about is that we now have divided Congress. That's generally a good thing, especially when you have a Congress that has bad ideas. It will at least put a stop, we hope, on any more money flowing out into the economy, at least in huge tranches, which has been one of the major problems and the fuelers of this inflation. I do worry, though, about the continued regulatory attack by the Biden administration on companies that are going to begin to feel increasing stress as economic conditions deteriorate. The administration could be doing something good here by pausing those regulations, but every indication is that it's going to get worse. And I also fear, too, that on certain discrete areas that there is bipartisan verve to jump in with some potential legislation aimed at industries, in particular big tech, that people haven't necessarily entirely thought out that could also have some ramifications for the economy.